Today's daf is daf ayin dalid. What I'd like to do first is review what we say in Yiddish oiservenik, meaning outside, without necessarily reading the entire text, what we need to know going into daf ayin dalid, and what we derive from daf ayin gimel amid beis. So first, the Mishnah records a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim regarding what's called a minchas chote shel kohanim. Now, when the kohen brings a mincha, it's kulo kolil. It's completely burnt on the mizbeach. And if he has a chet, which is called ole v'yored, like for example, maybe took a shvua denying that he owed money, and it turned out that that he had edus, and he denied that he had edus. In all those cases, if he's bedali dalus, he's on the lowest financial level, then he brings a mincha instead of a carbon zevach. And that mincha is kulo kolil, is completely burnt on the mizbeach. But Rabbi Shimon says that despite the fact that it's completely burnt on the mizbeach, nevertheless you need a kmitza, and the komets and the shiraim both, one after the other, will be burnt on the mizbeach. The Gemara tries to find a source for this. And quoting a brisa, it's based on a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Hey, which reads, V'hoisol hakohen kamincha. Now, the derivation from this pasuk of V'hoisol hakohen kamincha is that a kohen who brings a mincha, even though he brought the mincha as a result of his sin, nevertheless he can do the avoda itself on that mincha. So he does the four avodos, the service, on behalf of himself. And the Gemara asks, well, why do I need a pasuk for that? That's a general rule, that whenever a Kohen decides that he wants to bring a carbon on the Mizbeach, then despite the fact that he's not part of the Mishmar, there were 24 Mishmaros, and he wasn't on duty at that time, nevertheless he has carte blanche rights to bring a carbon. So the Gemara goes through a whole logical analysis why we might have had a Havamina that although, as a general rule, the Kohen can bring his own carbon, but we had doubts as to whether or not that would apply in the case of a chote. Because it's a little bit strange that, here he sinned and he was guilty of sin. The Gemara has categories like a shogeg and then even a mazid. And now he's bringing his own carbon. The Gemara thinks that's a little bit strange. But in any event, we have this pasuk of V'hoisa lakohen kimincha. And the Tanakama is of the opinion that in a case of a minchas chote, which is kulei kolil, there's no kmitz at all. You just take the mincha whole as it is and burn it on the mizbeach. Now, what does the pasuk mean? This is another pasuk which is in Vayikra, and we're fast forwarding from Perek Hey to Perek Vav, and there it says, "V'chol minchas kohen kolil tieh lo sei ochel." So on the one hand, the Torah says at the beginning of the pasuk that the mincha of a kohen is completely burnt on the mizbeach, but then it says lo sei ochel, it cannot be eaten. That's a very strange addition at the end of the pasuk, because if you tell me that it's completely burnt on the mizbeach, then obviously it's not going to be eaten. So the Brisa tries to make an attempt at interpreting this pasuk as referring to a minchas nidava. And by limiting it to a minchas nidava, the intent of the Brisa is to claim that if he voluntarily brings his own mincha, then it's kulo kolil, it's completely burnt on the mizbeach. And that's the beginning of the pasuk called minchas kohen kol tia. However, in a case where the kohen is obligated to bring a mincha, that's the case of the minchas chote, then if not for the pasuk at the end, which says lo te'achel, we would have entertained the possibility that the mincha of a chote, in the case of a kohen, should be eaten. And therefore the Torah added the extra phrase of lo te'achel. So v'hoisal ha-kohen kim mincha, and then, right, the Torah says that the mincha of the kohen, in the case of a chote, should be like a voluntary mincha. So we're comparing an obligatory mincha, which is the minchas chote, to a voluntary mincha. And in the case of a voluntary mincha brought by a kohen, then we know it's completely burnt on the mizbeach and there's no achila. And since we had a havamina that raised the possibility that in the case of the minchas chote, which is a chova, then maybe the carbon should be eaten, the mincha should be eaten. By virtue of this analogy between nidava and chova, we derive the conclusion that even in the case of the minchas chote of the kohen, which is a minchas chova, nevertheless it should not be eaten. So the Tanakama against Rabbi Shimon assumes that this comparison between a minchas nedava and a minchas chova in the case of a kohen is the subject of this pasuk. And that's why the Chachamim derive the conclusion that even in the case of a minchas chova of the kohen, meaning a minchas chote, he's not allowed to eat any part of the kohen of the mincha, like in the case of nedava. And Rabbi Shimon holds that it doesn't say in the pasuk v'hoisa lakohen kim minchaso, but rather it says kim mincha. And based on that diuk, that it doesn't say v'hoisa lakohen kim minchaso, but rather kim mincha, Rabbi Shimon comes to the conclusion that there's a different comparison over here. And that comparison is between the minchas chote of Kohanim and the minchas chote of Yisrael. So again, it's based on the fact that it doesn't say kimincha so, but rather it says kimincha. And a mincha here refers to the mincha of Yisrael. Now, what kind of mincha of Yisrael are we talking about here? We're talking about a minchas chote. Now, the minchas chote of Yisrael is subject to kmitza, and of course, in the minchas chote of Yisrael, after the kmitza, the shirayim are eaten by the kohanim, and now the pasuk is setting up a comparison to the minchas chote shel kohanim. What halacha is this comparison, this hekesh teaching me? It can't be teaching me that the shirayim are eaten. It just could be teaching me that there's a kmitza. So that the Minchas Chote Shel Kohanim, by being compared to the Minchas Chote Shel Yisrael, according to Rav Shimon's understanding of the pasuk, Kim Mincha, will teach us and will derive the conclusion from that Hekesh that just like a Minchas a Chote Shel Yisrael requires Kmitza, so too a Minchas Chote Shel Kohen requires Kmitza. But you might have entertained the possibility that therefore, if we take this analogy to its logical conclusion, then we should say that just like a Minchas Chote of Yisrael is the Shirayim are eaten after the Kmitza by the Kohanim, so too will apply that principle of Shirayim Necholim in the case of Minchas Chote Shel Kohen. Talmud Lomar, and that's where the pasuk tells me La Kohen Kim Mincha, and we're going to darshan it La Kohen Kim Mincha in terms of Kmitza, but Lo Leishim Kamincha. So how do we know this? That it is Kamincha with regard to Kmitza, but it's not Kamincha, and it's all burnt on the Mizbech. There's no Shirayim that are on their Cholah. So in order to reconcile what seems on the face of it to be a contradiction, we're going to say that the komets has to be burnt on the Mizbech on its own, and then following the Kmitza, the Shirayim have to be burnt on the Mizbech on their own. And that's the Shita of Rabbi Shimon. So let's pick up on Daf Ayin Dalid for today's study, and we'll count down from the top of the Amud to Ha Shetehe. So let's count down how many lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's the last word on the 8th line from the top. Ha Shetehe Avodasa Kshera Bo. Now we're going back to the Tanakama that we saw in the previous brisa, and he derived from the pasuk of V'hoisa lakohen kamincha that a kohen could do the avoda of his own mincha. So the Gemara says, "Ha shetei avodas kosher mihocha nafka mihosam nafka minayin lekohen sheba umakriv korbanos v'chol eis v'chol shoshi yirtzeh." How do we know that a Kohen could always decide that he wants to bring his own korban, and he'll do the avoda even though he's not one of the Anshe Mishmar? Talmud Loma, we derive it in a brisa from the pasuk Uba b'chol avas nafsho vishares. Vishares. So the last word in that pasuk is vishares, and the vishares means he could serve as the Kohen HaOved and do the avodas of the korban. And it's b'chol avas nafsho, whenever he decides on his own initiative he wants to bring a korban. So why then did the Tanakama find it necessary to derive from the pasuk v'hoisa lakohen kamincha that the Kohen who's bringing a minchas chote could do the avoda for himself? That's just a universal rule that applies to any korban that he wants to bring. So the Gemara answers, "Imi hosam hava mina hani milidover she'eno ba alachet." If the Kohen decides voluntarily to bring a korban, has nothing to do with a sin or a kapara, then we'll give him carte blanche and he can do the avodah. Avol davar sheba al chet emalo. So Gemara says, I don't get it. You're telling me that if it's Baal Achet, I would consider the possibility that he can't do the avodah of Hanami mehocha nafka, mehosam nafka. The pasuk says, "V'chiper hakohen al nefesh hashogeges bechet bishkaga, melamid hakohen miskaper al yidei atzmo." So we have another drasha from which we derive the conclusion that even in the case of a chet, albeit a chet bishkaga, the kohen is allowed to take charge and do the avodah for his own korban. Aval b'mezid lo kamashvan. How do we know that even if the Kohen was guilty of a sin, b'mezid, deliberately, that nevertheless he could still do the avoda for his own karma? For that, we need a pasuk to teach us that he can do so. Gemara asks, b'mezid heichi mishkachas lo, bizdon shvua. Let's say they took him to a monetary case. There was a litigation against him, and he denied that he owed any money, or he denied that he has testimony, and then he admitted that he sinned. And his denying of the oath was under, the denying of the testimony was under oath. That's called Shvuas Ha'edus. And then you have Shvuas HaPikado, where he denies any sort of financial obligation, and he takes an oath to that effect, and the penalty is that he brings a korban asha. By the way, there are two other cases where a violation b'mezid requires a korban, which is very rare, because usually a korban is for shogig and not for mezid. And one of them is Baal Shivcha Charufa, and the other one is a Nazir who is Mitame himself b'shgoga. All right, now we have in our Mishnah and in the Brisa a machlokus between Rabban and Rabbi Shimon regarding the Minchas Chote Shel Kohanim, whether it requires Kmitza or not. Tanya Idach, we have another Brisa that brings a third sheet of Tanoim. First Rabbi Shimon, which we've already seen. Minchas Chote Shel Kohanim Nikmetzes Vakomitz Karev B'fnei Atzma Shirayim Kreiv B'fnei Atzman. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Now this is the son of Rabbi Elazar, of Rabbi Shimon, and he agrees with his father halfway. Hakomitz Karev Liatzmo, that there will be a kmitza against the and that kmitza, that kometz, will be burnt on the mizbech on its own against the chachamim, like his father Rabbi Lazar. But hashirayim, which according to Rabbi Shimon, his father, should be burnt on the mizbeach like the kometz, just as a separate maisak Torah. But mispazmel beis hadeshen. Now, what exactly is this beis hadeshen? So the Gemara is going to assume the following. Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Havi bar Reb Yochanan. Reb Yochanan had a problem over here, because you're talking about something that should be burnt on the mizbeach, and you scatter it over the Beis Hadeshen. Beis Hadeshen dehecha. First of all, there were three different Beis Hadeshens. Idil mala hainu avua. Right? If it's something that's on top of the Mizbeach, meaning that after the Haktorah and the burning was finished, they piled up all the Afer, the ashes on top of the Mizbeach, then we don't have a machlokus here in this Brisa between Rabbi Shimon the father and Rabbi Elazar the son. Idil lamata, yesh la davar shekarv lamata. If it's lamata, which is called the Shefech Hadeshen, which is outside of Yerushalayim, as opposed to there was also ashes that were put in the Azara after the Haktar Sakarban, and then there was another Beis Hadeshen on the Harabayis, where other disqualified karbanos are burnt. That's in addition to the one that was outside of Yerushalayim. So Rashi here understands that the Gemara is referring to the Shefach Hadeshen outside Yerushalayim. Tosfos is of the opinion that no, we're talking about the Deshen inside the Azara. In any event, Rabbi Yochanan is objecting. I mean, you need a Haktorah on the Shirayim over here of the Minchas Chotei Shel Kohanim. So how could you put it in the ashes? Amalei Rabbi Abba Dilma leibud. That according to Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, we're going to require that the remnants and the shirayim of the Minchas Chodesh Kohen should be offered as Aktorah, but we're going to accomplish that by burning them, not by burning them on the Eish al Mizbeach, but rather discarding them. That's called le'ibu, discarding them and scattering them over the Beis Hadesh. So the Gemara doesn't like this answer that we have something that belongs on the Mizbeach and it should be burnt on the this, and we discard it and scatter it over the Beis Hadeshen. Achichole, they started laughing at him. And they said, "Chiesh lecha davar shekarev li'ibud," that the Torah requires that you're makriv to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you're gonna instead of being makriv it, you're gonna scatter it all over the ashes. And the Gemara says, Tani Avur de Bei Ravin, the Rabbi Ovin, that there is such a thing as discarding on the Beis Hadeshen, and that's Rabbi Loz's Shita, and it says, Kol minchas kohen kol iltia lo se achel, lachila hikshatia v'lo l'davar acher. So the minchas chote of the kohen is like the minchas chavitin, which is kuloi kolil. That's the daily carbon twice, half in the morning, half in the afternoon of the kohen gadol. As far as achil is concerned, the minchas chavitin is not eaten at all, and therefore the minchas chote shel kohen is also not eaten at all. But there's a difference between them. The minchas chavitim is burnt completely on the mizbeach, whereas the shirayim of the minchas chote shel kohen are li'ibud. They're scattered all over the Beis Hadeshen. So Gemara says, I don't get it. My Omer, where do you see this in the pasuk? I mean, the pasuk says, "Kol minchas kohen kol tia lo seachel." So the pasuk clearly indicates kol tia means on the mizbeach. Why are you telling me that you have shirayim after kmitza and you scatter it all over the Beis Hadeshen? So here we have Abai and Rava. Now, just by way of introduction, there's no machlokas here between Abai and Rava. The objection of Rava to Abai is going to be because he thinks that Abai didn't present it in the right way, just in the right nusach. Omer Abai hochi kamer kol minchas kohen lo se'achel. We're going to divide up this pasuk into two. We're going to mamash slice it down the middle. And the first part of the pasuk, which says, actually, the first part of the pasuk is called tia, but anyway, Abaye, this is what Abaye is going to rub Rava the wrong way, but anyway, he's fast forwarding to the last part of the pasuk, lo se'achel chovasa. That's referring to the minchas kohen, the minchas chote shel kohen, which is a carbon chova. And then when we go back to the beginning of the pasuk and it says kolil tia is nidvasa, that's referring to a mincha that was brought by the kohen voluntarily. In the case of the minchas chote shel kohen, he's not included in the beginning of the pasuk where it says kol minchas kohen kolil tia. He's only included in the end of the pasuk, which is called lo se'achel. So once again, let's just review this. The first part of the pasuk is referring to a minchas kohen of nidava, and the second part of the pasuk, the sefer that says lo se'achel, is referring to the minchas chote, which is a carbon chova. So in the case of the minchas kohen chov of chet, right? The minchas kohen shechata, it's not going to be included in the ratio of the pasuk kol minchas kohen kol iltiyah. And the Torah is just saying don't eat it, but the Torah is not saying completely burn it because that's only in the Nedava case. So what are we going to do in the Seifa, which is the Minchas Chova of the Kohen Chote, and the Torah is just saying Lo Seachel, but it's not saying that you have to destroy it. So we're going to take part of the beginning of the pasuk of Kol Il Tiyeh, and we're going to apply it to the Kmitza, the comments, and then we're going to take the Lo Seachel to the other half, and then now it's going to teach me that it requires its own Haktorah, but it's not the same Haktorah of Kol Tia at the resh of the pasuk, which is on the Mizbeach itself, but rather it's Li'ibud, which means we scatter it all over the Beis Hadeshin. Amalei Rava doesn't like the way Abai presents it, and he starts with the end of the pasuk and then goes back to the beginning of the pasuk. Sakina Charifa Mifsika Cry. Okay, I agree with you that there's a sharp knife that splits this pasuk into two parts, the resh and the sefer. But Ella Amar Rava, but you should say it this way. Kol Minchas Kohen Kol Tia, we go back to the beginning of the pasuk, is Nidvasa. That's referring to Korban Nidvam. And then the end of the pasuk comes later, and Lo Seachel Chovas. Fine. But now the Gemara says, I don't get it, neither according to Abai nor according to Rav of the Epach Hana. Why do you assume up front that in the Korban Nidava case it's Kulei Kolil on the Mizbech itself, whereas in the case of the Karban Chova of the Minchas Chote Shel Kohen, that's the end of the pasuk Lo Seachel. Why not do it the other way around? Why not say that in the case of the Minchas Chote, which is a Karban Chova of the Kohen, then it's Kula Kolil, and that's the beginning of the pasuk that says Kolil Tia. And on the contrary, in the case of a voluntary mincha of a Kohen, then we're going to say Lo Teachel, but we're not going to say Kula Kolil. So Gemara answers, Mistaber Nidvaso Havile Rebuye. Now, we have a principle in Kodshim, and it applies in other areas of Shas, of Halach as well, and that is that we have something that is Tadir, as opposed to something that's Eino Tadir. Now, if we compare a minchas nidava of a Kohen to a minchas chova, meaning a minchas chet of a Kohen, then the minchas nidava, even though it's voluntary, is much more common. It's more tadir. It's ordinary. It comes from time to time. For the minchas chote to come around, you need, first of all, there to be a Kohen, and secondly, you need that he did a chet, and all the other, conditions that have to be met. So therefore the Gemara says, if you're talking about burning the carbon on the Mizbeach, then it's referring to the Minchas Nedava Shekain to Dira, because it's frequent. I mean, again, it's not that the Minchas Nedava of a Kohen is daily, but it could be daily, meaning theoretically he might voluntarily do it every day. And that's called lo chati. There was no sin. Not only that, it's basim reche. It's got a pleasant aroma. I think pleasant aroma here is referring to something more ethereal, more heavenly. That up in Shemayim, it's more of a ritzui carbon because it's totally voluntary and has nothing to do with chet. But I don't get it, because why should the fact that it's tadir, or the fact in the case of a nadava, or that it's basim reche, why should that therefore mean that we burn it completely on the Mizbeach? That's I didn't catch. So I think that's the Gemara's next question, if I'm not mistaken. Adarab, on the contrary, I have more of a reason that in the case of the Minchas Hote, I would think that it should be Kulei Kolil. It should be completely burnt on the Mizbeach. In that sense, it's like the Minchas Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol. Shekeni Saron. Right? It's got a very striking similarity to the Minchas Chavitim of the Kohen Gadol, because all you need is an isaron of kemach. In the case of Minchas Chavitim and Minchas Chote, there's a fixed volume of one isaron of flour, but for a Minchas Nedava, one could donate up to 60 isronos. Not only that, chova, both the minchas chavitin of the Kohen Gadol on a daily basis, as well as the minchas chote of a Kohen, these are karbanos chova. But the Gemara says, I need a fish. For calculating, the similarities between the Minchas Chavitin and either A or B, either the Minchas Nedov of a Kohen or the Minchas Chova of a Chote, then the comparisons to a Minchas Nedov of the Kohen are more similar, I should say, are more numerous than those elements that, right, and similarity to Minchas Chavitin, than those elements that would equate a Minchas Chova, or what you call a Minchas Chote, to the Minchas Chavit. Now until now we've been dealing with Reb Shimon. Now let's go back to the Shita the Chachamim, who hold that the Minchas Chote of a Kohen is not subject to Kmitz at all. For Rabbanon, how do they know this? Hi v'chol Minchas Kohen kol tia lo seochel my ovidle. Oh, so now, according to Rabbanon, they're going to learn this pasuk, as referring to a minchas chote, and it's kuloi kolil, and there's no kmitz at all. So why does the pasuk say lo teachel? The lo teachel is completely superfluous. It's unnecessary. I mean, if it's completely kolil, according to the Rabbanan Shita, without any kmitza, without any shirayim, so of course lo teachel is going up on the altar. And the Gemara answers me, we need it for the following brisa. Eli el Yona bekolil toktar. Okay, so this is a reference to the Minchas Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, and that's the earlier pasuk, right? There are two psukim here, one after the other, in Vayikra Vav. There's pasuk Tesvav, pasuk Tezayin, and the first pasuk, which is the Minchas Chavitin, that's pasuk Tesvav, that's called the Elyona. Elyona means the first pasuk, the higher pasuk, and it says Kolil Toktar. Tachtona, the next pasuk, which refers to the mincha of a Kohen, right? Any mincha of a Kohen. We're not talking about the Minchas Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, is below Seyachel. And that lo seyachel prohibits the carbon from being eaten, but it doesn't require it to be burnt. And the pasuk kolil tia, which we said it has to be entirely burnt, actually means it should be offered on the mizbech in its entirety. And therefore, from those words alone, the Brisa could not derive the conclusion of the obligation to burn the mincha. Right? How do we know that I'm going to apply the same rule that applies to this one, meaning the minchas chavita to the mincha of a kohen? Talmud loma kolil gzer shavas. Twice it says the word kolil. Nemar kan kolil. Right, with regard to the regular mincha of a kohen, it says kolil. Nemar lahala, and then also with regard to the minchas chavita and the kohen gadol, it says kolil. Malahala bekolil v'toktar. Just like in the case of the minchas chavitin, the Torah commands us what? That it should be entirely burnt on the mizbeach. Afkan bekol toktir. So to the mincha of a kohen, which is kule, it should be kule kol. It should be completely burnt on the mizbeach. Umakan litain lo tasal achilaso. Just like in the case of any minchas kohen, the Torah says lo teochel, which is a lav, and if you eat it, you get malchus. Aflahal, and so too in the case of minchas chavitin, litein lo tasel achiloso. Boy Ravina, kohen sha'ochal min ha'emurim ma. Now this is a very strange question that Ravina is raising. No one's allowed to eat the emurim. Not even a kohen can eat the emurim. But the question is whether the kohen who eats the emurim has the same thrust of a violation, which is called a lav, and the violation of the lav would have to include the kohen in what's called lav de zorus. Zorus means a non-kohen. So in other words, when the Torah says kol zar lo yochal kodesh, that includes if a non-kohen would eat from the murim, and that's a lotas. Here, the Gemara in Ravina wants to suggest that the lav of lo yochal kodesh, which says kol zar, might apply to the kohanim as well.